You know, some court cases are just, well, court cases. But every now and then one comes along that completely changes the game. And that's exactly what we're talking about today. The case of S.R. Bommai versus the Union of India. This wasn't just about legal arguments. It was about the very soul of Indian democracy. And it completely redrew the lines of power between the central government and the states.
So let me ask you this. Can you imagine an entire elected state government just gone? Poof, dismissed with just one signature from the top. Not because they lost an election, but because the central government said so. It sounds crazy, right? But for decades, this was a very real and very common political reality here in India. The S.R. Bommai case basically stood up and asked a huge question. Is this really how a democracy is supposed to work?
So you're probably wondering, how on earth was something like that even possible? Well, the answer is found in one single, incredibly powerful, and, as it turns out, very controversial article of the Indian Constitution.
And that article is Article 356. Now, on paper, it sounds pretty straightforward. It gives the President of India the power to impose something called President's Rule on a state. And what that does is it effectively dismisses the government that you, the people, elected. The implications of this are, well, they're massive. It basically means the central government can just step in, take direct control, and sideline the people who were actually voted into power.
Okay, so the people who wrote the Constitution, they had a very specific idea for this power. It was meant to be a kind of emergency brake, a safety net for a true constitutional crisis. But the reality of how it was used? Whoa, that was a whole different story. It basically turned into a political weapon. If the party in power at the center didn't like the government in a particular state, well, they could just use Article 356 to get rid of them. And believe me, they did. Before this case, it was used over 100 times. Just think about that number.
All right, so you can see where this is going. This kind of thing couldn't last forever. The misuse was getting out of hand, tensions were boiling over, and a major constitutional showdown was pretty much inevitable. And it all finally came to a head in one single landmark challenge.
And that brings us to 1994. The case was S.R. Bommai versus the Union of India. S.R. Bommai's own government in Karnataka had been dismissed, and his challenge finally made its way to the Supreme Court. And let's be clear, this was so much bigger than just one man or one state's government. This was the ultimate stress test for Article 356 itself.
So the big question is, what did the court do? How do you fix a problem like this? Well, they didn't just get rid of Article 356. That would have been too simple. Instead, they did something much smarter. They built these incredibly strong guardrails around it. They laid down a whole new set of rules for how, and more importantly, when, this power could be used.
And the court's new rules really came down to three huge ideas. First up, judicial review. This meant the president's decision wasn't the final word anymore. It could actually be challenged in a court of law. Huge. Second, and we're going to talk a lot more about this one, was something called the floor test. This became the only way to prove if a government had a majority. And third, the court made it crystal clear that secularism is a basic, unchangeable feature of the Constitution. So you couldn't just dismiss a government for reasons that went against that core principle.
Now, all three of these were game changers, for sure. But one of these new rules stood out. It became the most powerful check on the misuse of this power. It was a really simple idea, but oh man, was it profound. It changed absolutely everything.
And here it is. The court said, look, you can't decide if a government has a majority based on some governor's opinion or a letter. No way. The only place to prove it is out in the open, on the floor of the Legislative Assembly with a proper vote. It's kind of like saying you don't decide the winner of a football championship in a backroom meeting, right? The game has to be played on the field. And that, right there, is the essence of the floor test.
So, let's talk about the legacy. What's the lasting impact of the Bommai case? Well, to put it simply, its impact is felt literally every single time there's a political crisis in an Indian state, even today.
I mean, the legacy is just immense. For starters, it put a major curb on the random, arbitrary dismissal of state governments. It strengthened India's federal structure, giving states more protection. It established that the executive's power isn't absolute, it can be checked by the judiciary. And maybe most importantly, it cemented the floor test as the gold standard, the ultimate proof of a majority. That term, floor test, is now part of our everyday political language, and it's all thanks to this one case.
So in the end, the S.R. Bommai case wasn't just another judgment. It was a constitutional earthquake. It fundamentally shifted the balance of power, creating a more accountable, more balanced, and stronger federal democracy for all of us.
And that really leaves us with one final big question to think about. The Bommai judgment, without a doubt, created these critical guardrails to protect our democracy. But as we see political battles constantly pushing up against those boundaries, you have to ask yourself, are those guardrails still strong enough today? Now that's something to think about.